Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Well, what does Donald Trump's pursuit of a new global order mean for Canada? Canada will send a delegation to Greenland next month, this amid more aggressive U.S. rhetoric about acquiring Greenland. You can call in with your thoughts on how Canada fits into all of this and what needs to be the Canadian government's response. We'll be joined by a retired senior military officer in our first half hour and the head of the Cascade Institute at Royal Roads University after 12:30. I'm Michelle Elliott. Welcome to BC Today. You can call us now. What does Donald Trump's pursuit of a new world order mean for Canada? And what are your questions about Canada's role and response? Our number is 604-669-3733. That's 604-669-3733. You can also dial 1-800-825-5950 or just hit pound 690 on your phone. We're also watching your emails at bctoday@cbc.ca and your comments on our TikTok Live. Well, following the U.S. strike and capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro over the weekend, focus is now shifting to other territories that President Donald Trump wants to exert influence over. Trump officials spoke in Washington today about the president's desire to acquire Greenland. The president has said the U.S. needs Greenland for national security reasons. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says the presidents, as far back as Harry Truman, have been interested in controlling Greenland.
Does the U.S. intend to buy Greenland? Can you clarify your comments to lawmakers this week?
Well, that's always been the president's intent from the very beginning. He said it very early on. I mean, this is not new. He talked about it in his first term, and he's not the first U.S. president that has examined or looked at how could we acquire Greenland. There's an interest there. But so I just reminded them of the fact that not only did Truman want to do it, but President Trump's been talking about this since his first term.
Meanwhile, Tilly Martinussen, a former Greenland parliamentarian, spoke with CBC this morning, and she said among Greenlanders, she sees outrage and anger, and that nobody wants to be a part of America.
Everyone knows that it's not about security because America can do almost anything that they want security-wise as long as we are negotiating about it. And he's effectively talking about the end of NATO, which is crazy for us to hear. And I think he should just come outright and say he wants the minerals, he wants the oil, he wants the rare earth minerals, and he wants to make sure that there's control with that, which is insulting in itself, as if we would just sell to some sort of dictator or something instead of helping our allies in the West. But the world order has been upended for Greenland as well.
Prime Minister Mark Carney said Canada will support Denmark's sovereignty and territorial integrity, which includes the autonomous island of Greenland. Next month, Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand and Governor General Mary Simon will visit Greenland. Joining me to take your calls on this as we ask you, what does this all mean for Canada and what are your questions about Canada's response and role, is Chris Kilford, a retired senior officer in the Canadian Armed Forces and a former military attaché. He served in Afghanistan and other posts, and this week he's giving a talk on the new U.S. national security strategy in Victoria for the Canadian International Council. Chris, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Well, I'm really pleased to be here.
Well, the news, it's certainly a dizzying start to 2026. So I'm very glad to be able to have you here, and thank you for taking questions from our audience as well as to help us understand. Part of what has been perhaps guiding the U.S. actions this week is the document you'll be talking about, the Trump administration's new national security strategy that was released last month. Trump has described it as, quote, a roadmap to ensure that America remains the greatest and most successful nation in human history. It sounds bombastic, perhaps not surprising, given what we've already seen from the Trump administration. But what to you is the goal now in light of the strategy?
Right. Well, the new strategy itself is 29 pages long. It's one in a long line of U.S. strategies that have been produced over the years. And its tone is quite different from what we've seen in the past with other strategies that speak about America's role in the world, positive role in the world, whereas this one is very much in your face and basically saying to the world, the days of the United States propping up everyone are over. And we are now going to be looking after our own interests. And if you don't like it, you'll need to get out of the way. And that is very much the tone that you take away from this new national security strategy.
And so how do you see then this week's events, the removal of Maduro in Venezuela, more overtures and more threatening overtures toward Greenland, even today's seizures of tankers, are those proof concept of this strategy?
Right. I think the first thing I would say is that so many people that have been commenting on the strategy, to me, haven't actually read the strategy, which is a problem in of itself. I mean, they pick out little things that they want to focus on and they run with it. So the first thing, of course, is to sit down and read the strategy and see what America is actually saying. And then, of course, to remind ourselves, as Jeffrey Sachs did recently on Monday at the UN Security Council, and said, look, you know, the fact is, since the Second World War, the United States has engaged in this behavior consistently, overturning governments and having their way with the world as they see it. And so Trump, in many respects, is just one of many U.S. presidents that have carried out the same sorts of things. I think what's unsettling for us mainly, though, is that he's in your face. He tells you what he's thinking, and he doesn't have any checks and balances, and nor do the people around him help either. And so we're seeing a very bare-faced America who's very, very now focused on and seeing parts of that strategy come to life. And we've watched what's happened in Venezuela and Greenland. We've watched American actions elsewhere. You know, the interesting thing about this strategy, it's full of contradictions. So while America would say, well, we're withdrawing unto ourselves and we're focusing on America first, you see them now, dropping bombs on Iran, on Nigeria, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, and other groups. They're very, very active. Venezuela right now. And of course, we worry about what's happening with Greenland.
And so in light of that, then what are the implications for global alliances, those that are, you know, providing global guardrails?
Yeah, it's quite frightening, really, when you think that your closest friend, your ally, is acting in such a fashion. Now, I've mentioned that in the past that they have been this way before, and they do take unilateral action, but usually not against their NATO allies, threatening their NATO allies, and being the behavior that we see. Stephen Miller, the Deputy Chief of Staff, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, saying what he does is incredibly unsettling, and it is leading to all sorts of problems within the alliance, because the simple fact is the U.S. underpins NATO and overall alliance security, and to see them acting in this way is terribly unsettling. It's a given. Countries don't really know what to do. America's closest allies are walking on eggshells around the White House, trying to figure out how best to approach things.
And how should Canada approach things?
Well, you know, the current government has come under a bit of criticism for not standing up to America. But look, I mean, that's easier said than done. I think currently what we are trying to do with our European allies is say to the United States that this conduct is unacceptable. But it's not like we're in a position to take action on our own unilaterally or punish America in some fashion. This, unfortunately, is the way it is when you are dealing with these superpowers. If you're Russia's neighbors, for example, there's often a sense of helplessness. And I've been speaking on this in Victoria last night and tonight. And I know with my audiences, when they watch the news, they hear what's happening in the United States, the way they're currently acting, there's a real sense of helplessness, much like Ukraine must have felt when Russia rolled in February 2022. Who was actually coming to help them against what is a superpower? So we're in that position right now, and governments have to tread carefully. If you overly criticize the United States, there will be some kind of blowback. We saw it with Doug Ford's advertisements against the tariffs. We saw what happened there, and other countries have experienced this as well. So we manage things as best we can, and we hope to get through this intact. Hope is not a method, though, I have to say that, and maybe at some point the Canadian government will have to take a stand.
Let me take some calls now. My guest, Chris Kilford, retired senior officer in the Canadian Armed Forces, giving a talk on the U.S. national security strategy that was released last month by the Trump administration. And he's giving that talk tonight as well in Victoria for the Canadian International Council. Let's take some calls asking you, what do you think Donald Trump's pursuit of a new global order mean for Canada? And what are your questions about Canada's role in response? Give us a call, 604-669-3733, 1-800-825-5950. And Shane is our first caller now in Hope. Hi, Shane. Thanks very much for joining us. What are your thoughts or your questions?
Yeah, a couple of very strong thoughts there regarding the overlap of where Canada sits with DRIPA, UNDA, and all the different declarations that need to come unfolded. But looking at that as a whole, as Canadians and Canadians that are truly not aware of the current situation, where we can be a really good ally with Greenland, maybe even partner up with them, but at the same time looking at the opportunity for us as Canada to actually stand up strong to support some of the other dramatic outcomes that are not foreseen yet, revolving around exactly what's happening with the other country there with the oil. So that situation is going to be boiling up a lot faster than all the Canadians want it to do. But at the end of the day, we're looking at, if we're not going to be in opposition or not going to align ourselves with the United States, which other country is going to step in to actually try to take over Greenland, and how that's going to look now? Is it going to be China? Is it going to be Russia, or another independent country that wants to exert their force and their dominance to be able to extract all those super resources that are in that territory? So that's my concern. But the biggest question now is where and what direction is going to be taken with the First Nations people being involved with the current Prime Minister, not just for polling attributes to make sure that they're going to sit in for another term, but how's that going to look overall? Because right now we're not going to feel the full impact, but we're going to definitely see some things happening underneath all these different regimes, especially right now with the different movements that are out there that are not publicized. So that's my concern right now. I'll leave it at that.
Shane, thank you very much for the call and speaking about Indigenous representation and participation. You know, we spoke with Terry TJ the other day around discussions around the potential proposed pipeline that Alberta is proposing from their province to BC's North Coast, and saying that Indigenous peoples need to be at the table. That is a question in Greenland, of course, given the Indigenous population there. What then does that mean for Canada? To whom should Canada be turning amid all of this to shore up more support, more alliances? Chris?
Well, first of all, Shane, that's a great question, and there's so much to unpack there, and I'll do my best to tackle it very, very quickly. Look, the Indigenous peoples of Greenland are outraged, obviously the Danish government as well, and they need to be consulted, and this needs to be discussed, and people are running roughshod over them. What's Canada doing in this regard? I think we're doing as best we can. We are standing up a consulate in Nuuk, and we will have the Governor General there, and we're making a very clear declaration to Washington as to where Canada stands on Greenland, its independence, and of course the role that Denmark has there as well. And you know, there are times when we have stood up to the United States. We didn't sign on to Iraq in 2003, the invasion. We made Washington quite angry with us, and so it's not like we haven't stood up to them before. And then there's the other issue about what else could we do with Greenland? What about Russia? What about China? And the fact is, you know, look, Russia's been stuck in the mud for 4 years now on a 1,000-kilometer front line in Ukraine, and they've basically taken themselves off as a major player. Look, they really couldn't do much to support Iran when America took action along with Israel. They weren't able to help Bashar al-Assad in Syria when he had to flee the country. And now, of course, there's not much they can do with their ally, Nicolas Maduro, and what's happened there. They don't have much to say. There's not much they can do. So largely, they're a spent force. That is what I would say. And of course, then China. And China has its own issues. They're far away from Greenland. And so at the end of the day, the United States can act in a very predatory fashion. And there are not that many or any that can really stand up to them in a solid fashion or take up arms against America. We have to watch, wait, manage. I said hope is not a method. You're calling from hope. But we have to somehow manage our way through this with the United States.
I was just going to jump on that. Hope is not a method. So what's at stake for Canada?
Well, I mean, look, I think we all hope for better days and that we can work our way through this period. But then the danger there is that, as I mentioned to folks last night, there's J.D. Vance. There are many around President Trump that if he was to somehow exit the stage, even tomorrow morning, this is a philosophy in the United States that's not going to go away. There's a real underpinning in the national security strategy that says, America's been taken advantage of for far too long, and now we're going to play a major role, and especially in the Western Hemisphere. So watch out, and that is the tone. And we've seen the manifestation of that with what they did with Iran and their bunker-busting bombs, dropping on nuclear facilities that the Iranians have. No one really expected that to happen. So this is a White House that's unpredictable, and hope isn't a method, but we have to somehow look for that brighter way out of this. I mean, it sounds a little weak when I say that, but in many respects, our hands are tied. We don't have the power, hard or soft, to go face to face with the United States. And again, this is why we feel so helpless in these situations.
We have a question now from Maria calling us from Victoria. Hi, Maria. Thanks for calling. Go ahead.
Hi. Maybe this has already been answered, but I want to have a clear understanding of why NATO collapses. Are you saying that, as we know with NATO, if one NATO country is attacked, then all are attacked? And would we not retaliate to the United States? What I think I hear your speaker saying is that, in fact, we wouldn't. And so is NATO, in effect, already collapsed?
Yeah, it's a good question, Maria. Thank you. Yes, Chris?
Yeah, so last year I had a wonderful opportunity to spend 2 weeks, 1 week in Poland, 1 week in Latvia, visiting our troops on the ground who are training the Ukrainian armed forces. And it's remarkable to see this presence that we have in Poland and Latvia. On any given day, about 2,000 Canadian soldiers in Latvia, part of a multinational brigade that we lead. And the NATO presence in the Baltics through Poland and so on is something to see, I have to say. And now Finland and Sweden are part of NATO. So the alliance itself is incredibly strong, and we know that. And it's getting stronger because countries are spending far more on defense than they ever did before. And in many respects, you can thank Donald Trump for that, because he made us take a hard look at our military capabilities and the lack of them. So in terms of NATO as an overall alliance, it's incredibly strong. But for many of the key capabilities, for that final word with countries like Russia and others, that we still rely on the power and the goodwill of the United States to underpin the alliance.
Right.
It's not that Europe is lost, though. I mean, the European Union has had a military element to it for a very long time, but it's simply not able to match the capabilities that the United States has. So if the alliance was to turn on itself and members became unhappy with one another, then, it opens up opportunities for others like Russia and so forth to take advantage of this. This is the last thing we want to have happen.
How strong is NATO? And how strong can it be in protecting Canada? I think this might be Mary's question.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, we're a big part of, don't forget NORAD, right? I mean, we work with the United States. We're very close to one another. Our two militaries are linked, our intelligence communities and so forth. And so those ties are very, very strong. So with America and Canada, we defend the continent. If you go to the Arctic Council, 7 of the 8 members of the Arctic Council are also NATO members. And so we talk to one another. And then, of course, NATO itself is a major alliance of 32 countries. So it's a very powerful organization. Again, if it turns on itself, it's problematic. So Canada plays an instrumental role But we're in an alliance for a reason, and that's because we can only do so much by ourselves. Everybody in that alliance, maybe save the United States, realizes that they can't go it alone. And so we all work together in tandem. And when it works well, it works well. What we're seeing out of the White House right now is an aberration. It's really concerning, and we're getting that. We're seeing it all the time right now, everywhere we look, social media and so forth.
Let's take a call from Jan in Nelson. Hi, Jan. Go ahead.
Hi there.
I understand.
Hello.
Go ahead. Go ahead. You were born in Denmark?
Yes.
Go ahead.
As I can see, we're probably not very amused. But the biggest question I have is if Canada does not come down firmly against the U.S.'s aspirations to basically seize Greenland, which would mean the end of NATO, who is going to stand up for Canada when Trump decides that Canada is going to become the 51st state, whether we like it or not?
Jan, thank you. Perhaps a good question to end with you. I know you've touched on this already, Chris, but it's the overarching question, isn't it?
It is. I mean, imagine how Ukraine felt when Russia rolled over the border and had to do their best to fight them off with our help also. But imagine how they felt. And I think that's how many Canadians feel, because yes, we have an armed forces, but we're spread very thin. We don't have the power and the capability that the United States has. And so when we're faced with this, we then now cast around for our friends and allies. And of course, centuries ago, we would have looked to the United Kingdom to come and help us fight off the colonies. You know, this would have been the thinking at the time. Well, that's not an option anymore. And so short of that, we need then to stand up for ourselves. And I don't know what that means at the end of the day. I would hate to see us having to, enter into some kind of conflict with the United States. I don't think we will. But we will have to be very careful in our relations and managing them with the White House going forward, at least with this administration and possibly with the one that comes after.
Let me just pause here and let our TV audience go into the break. We'll see you back here in 2 minutes. My guest is Chris Kilford, a retired senior officer in the Canadian Armed Forces, former military attaché. And this week, he's giving a talk on the U.S. national security strategy, the new, under the Trump administration, the new one that was released late last year. And let's take one more call here while we have Chris on the line. And Wendy is calling from Fanny Bay. Hi, Wendy.
Hi there. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
So to make it quick, I think Canada absolutely needs to stand up and be stronger against Trump. And I think the whole world is waiting for somebody to do that. And, Canada's used to take leads and things like this on global affairs, and we should. And one of the easiest ways to do it is to stand up for Cuba. We've had relations with Cuba since we shipped cod and rum in sailing ships across the seas. We've had an embassy there since 1946. We have Trudeau Fidel was one of Trudeau's pallbearers. We've had very good relations with this country. They have educated all their children. They've housed all their people. They've sent doctors around the world. Capitalism, absent regulation, morphs into investorism, and socialism scares the shit out of it. So socialism scares them. And so it's ideological about Cuba. And, it's time that Canada stands up and says, look, so many Canadians go to Cuba. This would be applauded by our politicians. Stand up and say, no, we are not going to let this happen to this country who dared to believe in the principles of Marti and Bolivar and try to do things a different way.
Thank you so much for the question from Fanny Bay. Appreciate it. And what about that route, Chris?
We've had good relations with Cuba, and it often got us in trouble with the United States. And now we're watching what's happening in Cuba. And I don't think it's going to be very good because they've been relying on Venezuela so much. When America took out Noriega recently in the last few days, there were about 30 Cubans that were killed, members of the security and intelligence services. So there's a relationship there. And I think, that's now broken. And Cuba's very much on its own. They're not going to get any help from China. They will not get any help from Russia. And so now they just sit and they wait to see what happens next. And I think exactly this, Canada's stepping up in the region. But this is the thing with us over the last couple of decades. We've not lost our way entirely, but you won't find any Canadians, or hardly any, on UN peacekeeping anymore. We know Haiti is a big problem, but we tend to work on that from the sidelines. And so Canada has stepped back in many cases from some of the global problems that we have. And I think this government and others need to sort of say, where do we stand now in the world on many of these issues, and not become so complacent. Look, it's easier to deal with some of these other problems, but with Trump in the White House, it's problematic. Now, talking about standing up to Trump for 1 second, the new Iranian army commander just said in the last sort of 24 hours that Iran would cut off the hand of anyone that struck them. And I think that's a very bold thing to say, and it's got Iran into a lot of trouble. His predecessor was assassinated. I mean, this is the world we're in. The gloves are off, and we have to be so careful. It's very easy to say, stand up to America, but there are repercussions, as we saw with the advertisements that Ontario did in Ontario with Doug Ford, his advertisements in Ontario, and the immediate backlash from the United States was to cut off trade talks. And we know CUSMA is coming, and we have to make our way through that and come out still intact. And so this is so delicate at the political level, and I think all of us need to get behind the government. Yes, it's a Liberal government, and yes, it's Prime Minister Carney, but I think all Canadians need to get behind the government and help this government navigate the way through. This is an all of Canada problem.
Chris, it's very, very good to speak with you this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us and taking calls from our audience as well.
Thank you.
That is Chris Kilford, a retired senior officer in the Canadian Armed Forces, former military attaché who served in Afghanistan and other posts. And tonight he's giving a talk on the new U.S. national security strategy in Victoria for the Canadian International Council. It is 12:32 now. You're with BC Today. I'm Michelle Elliott. Thanks so much for joining us. And coming up in our next half hour, we will continue to take your calls on what Donald Trump's pursuit of a new global order is going to mean for Canada, and what your questions are regarding Canada's role and response as well. Continue to take your calls with another guest coming up in our next half hour. Right now, it is 12:32, and it is time for a CBC News Update.
Good afternoon. London Drugs says it's closing its store in Vancouver's Woodwards building due to losses and safety concerns. President Clint Mulman says support from police helped cut down violent incidents against staff, but customer traffic didn't return. The store will be shut down at the end of the month. Police are dealing with what appears to be another extortion case. Several shots were fired at a Delta home early this morning. Nobody was hurt. And in the U.S., a driver has been shot and killed by ICE officers in Minneapolis. It comes during the Trump administration's latest immigration crackdown. Federal officials say the woman was attempting to run over the officers. The city's mayor described the killing as reckless and unnecessary. And now the forecast on the north coast. Rain and flurries this afternoon with the temperature falling to -1. Highs around -4 with a mix of sun and cloud in the Peace. In the central interior, including Prince George, some sun and cloud with a high of -2. Highs around 3 degrees with some sunshine in the Kootenays. In the southern interior, including Kelowna, a mix of sun and cloud with a high of 3 as well. And for Metro Vancouver, Greater Victoria, and the Fraser Valley, periods of rain this afternoon, wet snow at higher elevations with highs around 7. That's your CBC News Update from Vancouver.
Thank you so much, Rob. Rob Zimmerman in the CBC Vancouver newsroom. You're with BC Today. I'm Michelle Elliott. Thanks for joining us. And we have been getting a lot of emails this week as well. And we started with a U.S. strike in Venezuela and got your emails on that. Mo wrote us, Big Oil donated over $100 million to Trump's election campaign. And the reason number 47 isn't reaching out to the democratically elected, quote, losers, Gonzalo or Machado, is that the USA, under the direction of 47 and puppeteers, is leaning away from democracy. Linda writes, what happens if Maduro is found not guilty in U.S. court? Ben writes from Fort St. John, nobody has mentioned the muted and weak response from the Canadian government in comparison to the congratulatory pom-pom waving response from Poilievre and the Conservative Party. Yet another wedge issue and a distraction. Randy writes, the Americans are responsible for the last 20 years of sanctions and subterfuge against Venezuela. There was and is little or nearly no drug smuggling originating in Venezuela. Hugo Chavez lifted over 7 million people out of poverty and helped other countries with cheap oil. And we also got some more emails on the pipeline question. We asked you yesterday if this brings about the urgency or new urgency for a new pipeline to BC's coast. We got more emails on that too. Kathy writes, fear-mongering by invisible powers. Wildfires and water shortages mean anything to anyone? Joanne writes, we need to ask why we continue to invest in an economy that has proven to be destructive and costly when we know this industry is responsible for climate change. Allison writes, let's follow EB's lead and focus on building a refinery here in Canada. We export raw oil, raw logs. What else? Thank you for your emails. bctoday@cbc.ca. I'm Michelle Elliott. It is 12:36 now. Thank you very much for joining us. You are with BC Today. Thanks for joining us on CBC Radio, CBC Television, and live streaming as well on YouTube. Well, as we saw the U.S. strike on Venezuela last weekend, President Donald Trump's vision for U.S. foreign policy is becoming increasingly clear. We're asking you, what will Donald Trump's pursuit of a new global order mean for Canada? What are your questions about Canada's role and response? You can call us now, 604-669-3733, 1-800-825-5950. And we have lots of calls on the line, and another guest as well joining us now. My next guest has co-authored an op-ed piece that warns, quote, we need to prepare for the possibility that the U.S. uses military coercion against Canada. Thomas Homer-Dixon is the executive director of the Cascade Institute at Royal Roads University in Victoria. Thomas, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be with you.
Well, first I'll ask you what is going through your mind today?
Well, things are developing very quickly.
They
as
sure
you know.
are. Yes.
The change in a sense, the world order and our perception of the world order since last Thursday or Friday is just remarkable. Right now, the focal point seems to be, partly we've got this issue of the tankers being seized, but really what's happening with Greenland and to what extent the Americans, especially Stephen Miller, the deputy chief of staff in the Trump administration, are going to pull back a bit from their incredibly bellicose language about the potential military occupation or seizure of Greenland, which of course would have just extraordinary repercussions for NATO and also for Canada.
Yes. What are the implications for Canada?
You take a look at the map of the world from the North Pole, looking down over the Northern Hemisphere, and you can see that Greenland really is this huge mass that blocks access to, for instance, the northern Arctic archipelago of Canada. And geopolitically, given that the United States possesses Alaska and is to our southern border, and then if we're to possess Greenland, we would be, for all intents and purposes, almost surrounded by a hostile country, an increasingly hostile country, or a country that has, let's say, some designs potentially on our territory.
Now, you argue that because of that, the Canada needs to be prepared for potential military coercion. What do you mean by that?
So Adam Gordon, who's my co-author, and I were quite careful. We're not talking about masses of troops being accumulated at the border and then rolling across, tanks thundering and stuff like that. I hope not. But I think that what we're seeing with the Trump administration, especially with respect to Greenland, is a kind of comfort level with the explicit use of military force and military coercion, even potentially with allies, that should give Canadians pause. There's no reason in principle why this kind of behavior wouldn't be applied to us at some point over a territorial or border dispute, or perhaps over the secession of Alberta from Canada. It's a scenario that we lay out in the article. Mm-hmm. So Canadians need to start thinking. We obviously have a radically different relationship with the United States than we did a year ago. maybe in some sense, a radically different relationship than we had with the United States even 2 weeks ago. People need to start recognizing in Canada what kind of actor we're dealing with. This is an actor, especially as articulated by Stephen Miller, that is very comfortable using coercive military force to attain its ends and thinks it basically has the right to do whatever it wants to pursue its particular geopolitical interests, including seizing resources in otherwise sovereign nations as necessary.
So what exactly, and I appreciate you said you being careful when it comes to the wording there, you also lay out in your piece, military action that the U.S. has taken. So what should we be, what's at risk? What should we be worried about?
So I mean, there is a kind of a qualitative difference between Venezuela and Greenland. And I think this is part of what's given people real pause over the last few days. I mean, the Maduro regime was outrageously bad. I mean, it crushed the economy, tortured and killed people. It's just one of the worst autocracies in the world. You can paint a plausible picture that the intervention was justified on humanitarian, democracy, or national security grounds. It's very, very difficult for the United States to develop that kind of narrative about Greenland. This is a NATO ally. We are in an alliance with these people. It's a democracy. The Greenland population hasn't had a vote or a say in this matter. All of that doesn't really seem to matter to Stephen Miller. And he was quite explicit over the weekend in his interview with Jake Tapper on CNN. So we need to take that in consideration. I mean, we lay out a scenario in our article, Adam Gordon and I, about a secessionist vote in Alberta. The secessionists are defeated. Let's say it's a vote of, say, 30% plus for secession, but it's not a majority. But it's been influenced by a significant infusion of MAGA money coming in, disinformation campaign and the like. And then subsequent to the vote, President Trump says the results are fake, that the secessionists actually won. And he knows that the results, his intelligence agencies are telling him that the results were over 50%. Then there's an appeal from, say, some radical separatists in Alberta. There are a few who are really quite extreme, who appeal to the United States for help and claim that they're being oppressed in some respect. One could imagine at that point President Trump moving some troops to the border, northern Montana border, and saying to the rest of Canada, you need to let Alberta secede. There's every single step in that scenario is plausible, given what we've seen President Trump do over the last while, and given the kind of language that Stephen Miller is using. So we need to take this kind of thing seriously, and Canadians need to start gaming out how we're going to respond. I mean, there are a number of things we can do in advance in that particular scenario. We can make sure, for instance, that the electoral process in Alberta is not influenced by MAGA money and by American influence, by disinformation, that it's extremely clear what the results are. We also need to think how we're going to respond if there is at some point an attempt by the Trump administration to actually imply or be explicit with military coercion against Canada.
I'll ask you more about that in a moment. We'll take some calls now and take people's questions and comments. And Maurice has been waiting in Vancouver. Hi, Maurice, go ahead.
Oh, hi. I just got some comments on Greenland. I used to work there back in 2008 at a gold mine in southern Greenland. And, all the airports in Greenland were built by the Americans during World War II. All of them, every one of them. I mean, some of them are in disrepair, but you have to remember the Americans could have taken over Greenland in World War II instead of waiting till now. But anyway, the other thing is they have their base at Thule, Greenland, way up at the north end of the country there. They can see right into Russia. I mean, I don't know why Trump wants to get more of the territory. And in the Canadians, we have our base at Alert, and we can see right into Russia. I mean, I can't see the point of what Trump is doing unless he's just trying to keep the Republican Party on the radar. I mean, if it was the Democrats in power right now, they wouldn't be talking about any of this. They'd be navel gazing on domestic policy. But with him, he wants Greenland, but I can't see why, because they have enough technology up there in the first place to look at to prevent Russia from coming in and invading us. So anyway,
So
that's my point.
Maurice, thank you. That argument that it's for security's sake doesn't hold water with you. Thank you very much for your call. Bob is next in Greenwood. Hi, Bob.
Yeah, I kind of have to disagree with the last or what's being said here. If there was a war now between Russia and with China, you have to be strategically placed now. When these big super missiles start coming over, you want to start shooting them down as soon as you can, because it's only a few minutes to the target. And also, I want to say, because before the break, the guy talked about Russia coming into Ukraine. Putin came in after it was a request by the Russians in Ukraine, because the Ukrainians had already killed 18,000 Russians. And then another thing I want to make a point on is that when the Berlin Wall came down, that was Gorbachev and Reagan that made that deal. And the deal hinged on this, that NATO would not encroach 1 inch towards the east. Now, they've been when there was another Clinton, when Clinton got in, he disregarded that agreement, and NATO started marching and taking over and putting in military things in the old Soviet Union satellite provinces. And what's happening now is what happened before, when the U.S. told Khrushchev, get your missiles out of Cuba or we're going to war. Putin has been saying, I can't have Ukraine join NATO and have missile silos 5 minutes away from Moscow.
Okay.
Now the shoe's on the other foot. Now we're whining like a bunch of babies, I think. But anyway, God bless you all. Thank
Bob,
you for the call.
Thank you very much for the call from Greenwood. I'm going to go to my guest, Thomas Homer-Dixon, for your thoughts on that kind of, I guess, the reasoning that he's pointing to.
Well, let me talk first of all to Maurice's points, because I think he said something very important, which is that, at least with respect to Greenland, the United States can get everything it wants with current arrangements. It has an agreement with Denmark in place that was concluded during the Second World War that allows it to establish any kind of security installations and put in place any kind of military activity that it wants across the entire island. So there's no restriction whatsoever. It's not even clear the United States have to say much to Denmark, just needs to say, we're going to do this according to the agreement. It's incredibly loose. It was written up in the New York Times this morning. And then with respect to extraction of resources and military minerals and the like, again, the people in Greenland have been quite clear that they'd love to go into business with the United States to increase extraction activities and get mining rolling on a much larger scale within Greenland. So there actually is no restriction on the United States in terms of either its economic interests or its security interests in Greenland. And so one does have to wonder exactly what's going on here. Why is it that they become so obsessed with actually putting the American flag itself on this territory? And with respect to your second caller there, I mean, the stuff about the Ukrainians killing 18,000 Russians is complete nonsense. But the issue with respect to expansion of NATO and the threat to Russia, there is a legitimate debate about that and whether NATO expanded too far and too fast and created security and insecurities for Russia. But really, the fundamental issue between Russia and Ukraine is that Putin doesn't want a functioning democracy on his doorstep because it would undermine the legitimacy of his regime. So he's trying to destroy the Ukrainian political system and take over the country so that it doesn't affect his legitimacy as an authoritarian ruler. But we could go way down this abyss or this rabbit hole conversation.
We certainly have when it comes to that in NATO.
So I'm just going to leave that aside for the time being.
Sure, yeah. But I appreciate your clarifying as well. In fact, Jackie, I wanted to make sure to get back to you on that. Let me go to Annette at 108 Mile Ranch, because this is pertinent to what your argument in your article has been about, Thomas. So go ahead, Annette. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I have so much to say, but I'll try to keep it to the point. First of all, I don't agree with what Chris Kilford said, because we are way beyond, trying to placate this president of the United States. And it doesn't matter what we do anymore. I do agree with some of what Homer-Dixon said. We need to do something. We need to boost our military. Unfortunately, we're probably 20 years too late. But, the moment Trump mentioned Canada, I knew we were in trouble. And I think our prime minister should be standing up right now for Greenland and giving, strong wording, because we're going to be in the same position. I guarantee you he's going to take Greenland, and he's going to come for us. And as a matter of fact, based on what I've been hearing on the news, I wouldn't be surprised if he goes into Iraq today or tomorrow. I've heard there are tons of ships flying into the UK right now, and I listened to the whole UN report, and I agree with Jeffrey Sachs. They should have done something, and they should have given a stronger voice.
Annette, thank you very much for the call. So that criticism of the Prime Minister, of the Canadian government not standing up strongly enough, what do you make of that, Thomas?
Well, I think that our Prime Minister is in an enormously difficult situation, and I think for the most part he's been navigating this difficult strategic terrain very well, which is economic, political, geopolitical, and the like. But I would have liked to have seen a stronger statement about Venezuela, but I think the focus really has turned to Greenland just in the last couple of days.
Yes.
And I think there's a recognition that this is a tripwire potentially, and I think the Europeans the Prime Minister joined the statement from the Europeans yesterday about Greenland. We need to be very explicit that is not acceptable. Any kind of American coercion or military action or any attempt to do something that the green people in Greenland don't agree with is simply not acceptable. There's another element to this story, and I don't know if you want to go there, but that's really what Canada should do if it's facing the prospect of perhaps some kind of either implicit or explicit U.S. military coercion.
Yes, please. That was going to be my next question. Go ahead.
It's kind of always the next question, and it should be, right? So we have to approach this problem the way the Scandinavian countries do with respect to Russia, and they have a long experience designing a defense posture with respect to a giant and threatening neighbor, and basically it means developing national service programs and homeland defense programs that convince that potential aggressor that any attempt to take territory or coerce their countries will cost an enormous amount. But people often get confused. They often say, oh, well, we could never defeat the Americans. Well, that's not the point. Of course we can't. But we can make sure that the cost of any kind of coercive attempt is significant enough through developing homeland defense and community defense programs like we see in Scandinavia, that it just wouldn't make sense. That the cost of benefit calculus for any potential aggressor is clearly on the side of not undertaking any kind of aggression. And so we have made a proposal at the Cascade Institute, a detailed proposal that's been submitted to the federal government for a national service program that includes community defense, homeland defense, various kinds of community service corps, youth programs, and the like. These are things that would actually benefit the country in many respects independently in response to emergencies, critical events, disasters, and the like. The Canadians want to do something. They want to feel involved. There's an enormous support for responding to these existential threats to our country. Well, let's give them the opportunity and pull together. And then, frankly, I think the Americans will just leave us alone.
I want to ask you about what we are seeing right now, which is trips being planned for China. BC's premier going to India seems to be a way of trying to shore up, support more diverse trade relationships. What do you make of that as a strategy?
I think it's essential. I mean, look, we can't even feed ourselves in this country. One of the things issues the Cascade Institute is focusing on right now is trying to develop a plan for national food sovereignty. We have put ourselves in a situation of extraordinary vulnerability even if the United States hadn't flipped to become this less than constructive neighbor, there are real questions about whether we should have made ourselves so vulnerable to economic and political shifts in that society.
Okay.
So diversifying our trade, diversifying our economic base, and developing the capacity to produce more of the goods and services we need internally. We have a large economy and a large population now. I think all of that makes a huge amount of sense. It's all part of a program of economic and political resilience for the country.
Let's take in one last call here. Michelle in Nanaimo, go ahead, please, to your question.
Oh, hi. Thanks for taking my question. It was about the technology and the NORAD agreement up north, and if we are actually moving ahead, as I understand, Carney is choosing to build our military, and the expense is quite considerable to become more autonomous up north and on the northern border. And I wondered if that's true and if that can point to how Canada is going forward.
Yeah, Michelle, thank you so much for the question. I have about a minute and a half, Thomas, if you can go ahead, please.
Yeah, so we have a real tangled mess here, right? We have a deep security cooperation in NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command. The deputy commander of NORAD is a Canadian. And we are in conversations with the United States over participation in the Golden Dome ballistic missile defense program for North America. But there's also real concern about the United States, again, implicitly or explicitly using its military forces to exert influence or even take territory in the Arctic from us. This is a multi-dimensional chess game in the Arctic. I think the one thing, just very quickly, is that we need to focus on economic development and sovereignty projection in the Arctic. That means getting more economic activity up there, more supplies of energy, and ultimately more Canadian forces to assert our sovereignty in that territory.
It's very good to have you as part of this conversation. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. Thomas
Homer-Dixon, Executive Director of the Cascade Institute at Royal Roads University. Thanks so much to all of our callers. You can email us bctoday@cbc.ca.